The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Tim Baker's my name. I first of all want to apologise, unfortunately, because I had to cancel this first session a week ago. I had a few technical issues with the internet and what have you, but hopefully you can hear me now. In fact, I would like to check to make sure that's the case. So if you're unfamiliar with this, if you go and look on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a question box there. If you could just open that up, and could you just type in on your keyboard the word clear? That lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. So could you just do that? That at least we want to make sure that it's all great. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, John. Hi, Margaret. Thank you. Thanks, William. Thanks, Marsha. Okay, looks like we're getting quite a few coming in now. That's excellent. So obviously that's the first thing. I'm being heard. So look, let me talk about a few things about the series before we get underway, give you a bit of an idea about how all this works. Now, what will happen is that at the end of this session at 1:30 or just before, whenever, I will then be sending you an email, and in that email you'll get a copy of the slides, or a link at least to the slides, which I'll upload to YouTube, and you'll also get a copy of the recording. Sorry, the recording will be uploaded to YouTube, the slides will be at SlideShare. So you'll always get a copy of the material at the end. So you don't need to take a lot of notes or anything like that. You'll get all of that in due course. That's part of the deal. The second thing is that during the course of these broadcasts, we can't unmute everybody, because if we did that, there'd be so much background noise that no one would hear anything. So the only way we can really make this interactive is for you to go to that question box that you just went to, and you type in your question when you have it. It can be a question, a comment, an observation, whatever it might be. You put it into that question box there. Now, what happens by doing that is that I get to see it. In fact, I'm the only one, in this broadcast that will see your question. And then, of course, when I see it, I'll refer to it. So the idea is, don't wait until the end, because there won't be the sort of awkward 10 minutes where we're waiting for people to get their questions organised. As soon as you can think of something that you want to respond to, go ahead and respond to it, and I'll deal with it as we go. And that way we can make this as interactive as possible. Now, the other thing is that I should say is that I give you homework at the end of this. So the homework is nothing terribly onerous. It's really around something practical that you need to do as a result of what you've learned from the topic. So as you can imagine today, because we're talking about feedback, it will be about giving feedback. And so the whole idea is, in between the fortnights that we meet, although it'll be a little less now because of the problems we had last week, but in between sessions, the idea is, of course, to put into practice what you've learned. And so that's where the real learning takes place, not so much in the webinars themselves. That's the starting point. So just a couple of key things to think about before we move on any further. Of course, you have access to me between between webinars, and you can send me an email if there's something you would like to discuss, or a question, or maybe you might want to tell me about some of your war stories in the workplace or whatever. You're more than welcome to do that, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, of course. So that's how it all works. So sit back and enjoy, and don't forget to ask your questions if and when they arise. So what you're seeing in front of you now on your screen is, you can see the full program on the left-hand side. And I've selected these topics for very good reasons. I think they are the topics that probably will give you the greatest results in terms of your own ability to lead other people. So obviously today I won't go into it in detail, because that's what the session's about. Now, one of the things you'll get in my email, either this afternoon or tomorrow, you will get an invitation to complete an influencing capabilities profile, which is my own profile. you can get that done electronically, and it's all part of the cost. So you can do that, and that will allow you to bring that along for the next session in Unit 2, and you'll get a debrief on what all that means, and you'll get a little bit more of an understanding of how you can improve your capacity to influence other people. In session 3, we'll look at optimizing team performance, and essentially that's around building better conversations with the people that you lead. And I don't mean chit chat, of course. I'm talking about developmental and performance conversations. So we'll talk about that in Unit 3. In Unit 4, we'll talk about getting the very best out of people, and I'll share with you a couple of very practical tools that'll help you just get that little bit of extra discretionary effort from the people that you lead. And you'll have a diagnostic second one to complete there, which isn't electronic. This is a paper one. We haven't got that online yet. And that'll be setting you up nicely for Unit 5, which is about understanding people and their personalities. So we'll complete it then. I know probably many of you have done MBTI and DISC and a whole range of other ones. This is one that I put together that I think is a fairly accurate and simple exercise to complete. And then in Unit 6, we'll look at facilitating effective meetings. And why that? Because basically our whole life is a meeting, isn't it? This is a meeting, and when this is finished, you've got another meeting, and it goes on forever. Many of those meetings, of course, we're participants in, but as a leader, of course, you will, as your career develops, will continue to facilitate meetings. And so therefore it makes sense to become good at meetings, because let's face it, the majority of meetings we attend are not that great. They're not effective, they're not stimulating, they don't give us a chance to be involved. So that's why we're covering that session at the end. So hopefully you can see the relevance of what I'm trying to do here in the Lunch and Learn series. So enjoy, and let's get stuck into Unit 1 today. Now, I just want to put up a quote to start the ball rolling on feedback, and just to sort of set the scene, if you like. And let me just sort of read through this quote, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. If annual reviews are the only time when feedback is given, that's a problem, but it's certainly better than nothing. I think this is very true, that a lot of people save up all their feedback for the traditional performance review. And it is a problem in the sense that by the time the review comes up, the feedback is well and truly, it's gone, or the event at least that the feedback is about has gone. Two types of feedback, of course. There is positive feedback, and there's constructive feedback or critical feedback, whichever way you want to call it. And I would suggest to you that one of the things that I really would like you to do more so, even if you're doing it already, is give more feedback. Moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, never-ending feedback all the time. And you will find that it'll give you great results. And I'm going to share with you some information that might demonstrate that to you. So let's look at the next slide, and I just want to make a point about this. Here's some interesting statistics from some of the research. 60% of employees don't understand their organisational goals. Now, we've got people in this webinar who are in the public sector, the private sector, and not-for-profit. So all three sectors. Now, I believe that's very true, that a lot of people haven't got a clue, or the majority of people haven't got a clue at least, of where the organisation's heading and what their role is in the organisation. And of course, a lot of that is because they're not receiving regular, consistent and productive feedback. 87% of employees aren't engaged in their work, and worse still, 20% are actively undermining value their peers create. Now, I don't know whether it's 87%. I've seen figures of around 70%. I do believe it's over 50. But so our key thing is, how do we engage people's hearts and minds in the work that they do? There's no magic solution, but at the end of the day, if you're not giving feedback to people on a regular basis, I can assure you, you will end up with more disengaged team members than you perhaps ought to. So feedback is critical to engagement. In fact, the research demonstrates that. 77% of employees say their performance would improve with more feedback. So we're getting that from the people that the feedback is directed to. Giving feedback, it can increase engagement by 60%. And I'll talk about that a little further in a moment. So feedback is absolutely vital to employee engagement. Now, just because you give feedback, of course, doesn't mean that people will be engaged, but what you're doing at least is you are opening up the possibilities of creating an environment where people are more likely to be engaged. These figures, Daniel's just asking where these figures come from and how old are they. These figures come from Deloitte's, and Deloitte's does a lot of research, of course, in the workplace. These figures are probably about or less than 5 years old, so they're fairly current, Daniel. So yeah, but look, just because there are figures here doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate and applicable to all organisations. I guess I'm just painting a picture that feedback is really important, if you can see what I'm trying to do. Thanks, Daniel. So where are we? Whoop, I'm going too far. Coming back, yeah. So 50% of managers fail to hold their team members accountable and have the hard conversation. And that's been my experience. I work across 21 industries, and I think that what we've got to try and do is have those difficult conversations when they're needed. There's no point in avoiding them. They don't actually get any better. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it doesn't magically improve. In fact, in many cases, it makes it worse. So in the process of this, we will talk about that. So I'll talk about some of the courageous conversations that you and I need to have on a regular basis. 57% of employees say that they want the critical feedback that helps them improve, right? So people want feedback. Now, it's interesting. People want feedback. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll appreciate or accept it at the time, but they want it. So it's a very funny thing. They want to know where the line in the sand is. They want to know where they are positioned. But that doesn't necessarily mean they might receive it with the graceful way that it's perhaps, they might not receive it with grace, but they do need it. And so I think this is important, and that's why we've got rules and regulations and laws and all of these things in society that we've got. And in your organisations, you've got policies, procedures, manuals, and all sorts of things. The whole purpose of all that is because human beings fundamentally need to know where they stand. And of course, feedback is one of the mechanisms, and probably one of the most effective mechanisms, to actually let people know exactly where they stand in relation to your own expectations of other people. So food for thought. Obviously, the point I'm trying to make here is that we need to be giving people more feedback. Now, this graph simply looks at the notion of, so blue or green, I'm colourblind by the way, but I think it's green. Green is good, red's not so good. So that's the first thing. But up the top here, you'll notice that if you only ever gave positive feedback, so you never gave negative feedback, but you only gave positive feedback, you are likely to still have a very engaged team. So positive feedback is good, it's important, and your homework is going to be around giving some positive feedback just to get you into the groove of it. Now, interestingly enough, if you only ever gave negative or critical feedback, it's still likely to engage your people. In other words, they will know, they'll feel secure in the knowledge, assuming, of course, it's done the right way, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But assuming it's done the right way and it's done respectfully, but nevertheless talking about it critically, it's likely that it'll still improve engagement. Now, here's where it's interesting. If you give no feedback at all, whether it's positive or constructive, you will disengage people, okay? That's the reality of it. So your job, obviously, is to give people feedback. And by doing that, you're likely to engage people, whether it's positive or constructive. So something to think about there. Now, a couple of things about feedback I want to continue with. roughly 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. All right, now that's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously it's much more difficult to give constructive feedback because you're not sure how the person might receive it. But ultimately people are saying that that will be helpful because at least I'll know how far away I am from your expectations if it's constructive feedback. Now, the secret of having, your people listen to your feedback is ultimately whether or not they respect you. So what it basically means is that, respect obviously is earned, and it takes a while to get people's respect. I believe that Lunch and Learn and what you learn in this Lunch and Learn series will help you to improve your respect regardless of where it is right now with your people. And of course, the best way to get respect from anybody is to be authentic. In other words, be yourself. I think sometimes leaders try and be something other than who they are, and of course everyone can work that out very quickly. So being authentic is critically important, and I'll talk more about that as the series goes on. So what it basically means is that you can give the same feedback to two people. One respects you and one doesn't, and you will get two different responses. Obviously the person that respects you may well listen, they may well take on board what you've said, and they may well try and improve their own performance. And the other one that doesn't respect you may just ignore it or dismiss it. So it is important that so you can have the best techniques in the world, but if you're not respected, it's going to be difficult for you to be effective and influential when it comes to giving feedback or anything for that matter as a leader. So it is all about winning people's respect. Now, in terms of managing expectations, it's actually quite complicated. So let's go through it. There are 7 questions that I'd like you to ask yourself as I go through these. And ask yourself honestly, are you doing this to the best of your ability? Because if any of these questions are answered in the negative, then it's likely that you're not managing your expectations of your team the way you should be. So let's have a look. The most fundamental question is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you absolutely clear about your expectations, not only of yourself, of course, but everyone else in the team? Are you absolutely crystal clear about where that line in the sand is when you're dealing with people? Obviously, if you're not clear about that, then nothing else matters. So you need to be absolutely clear about what you expect from other people in your team. Now, just because you have those expectations, of course, doesn't necessarily mean anything, because obviously another question you've got to then ask is, have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, a lot of managers will say to me that I've done it. People don't seem to take it on board. Well, there's a whole reason for that, a whole lot of reasons for that, possibilities for that. But ultimately, just communicating it once is not going to, it's not going to be effective. You need to do it in context, that is, in the situation where you're giving the feedback. You need to do it one-on-one, and more so than in a team. Certainly you can sort of have a team meeting and explain these things, but ultimately it won't have any great impact unless you do it one-on-one, because then it's personalised, and then people can actually consider it in the context of their own work. So have you communicated those expectations to people? Because people are not mind readers. They can't work it out unless, of course, you've explained it very clearly. Now, you might say, well, my manager hasn't communicated to me his or her expectations. Fair enough, but that doesn't necessarily give you a license not to do it with your team. So that's important. So you have your own expectations and communicate them. We've still got 5 questions that can get in the way of managing expectations. Question 3 is, do my team members actually understand my expectations? So it's all very well communicating them, but do they really understand them? And it's not likely that people will say to you, look, Fred, look, Mary, I don't understand what that expectation means. They're not likely to say that. All they'll do is perhaps nod or maybe not even acknowledge it. and all the while they're wondering in their head what it actually means. So you need to explain it in terms of being for people to actually understand it. And that's very, very important, and a lot of people overlook that. So don't make the assumption that people actually understand what your expectations are. So understanding it is only a fundamental level. So the next step is, do they accept them? So I can understand your expectation, but I may not accept it. So for example, in a private sector organisation, if I'm a sales manager and I set budgets that are impossibly high for other people, and thinking to myself that if I set high expectations, high budgets, it's likely that people might meet halfway, which is probably better than where they would before. You know, the old adage of aim for the sun, you'll reach the moon. So that people need to accept them, because obviously if they don't accept them, they're not likely to meet them. And of course, again, people aren't necessarily going to say to you, I don't accept that, or I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. They just quietly go away and not meet them. And then you get frustrated, of course, about why that's been the case. So I need to understand them and I need to accept them, but that's not the end of the road. Then the next question you've got to ask yourself is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? Just remember that we're living in a world where there are lots and lots of balls in the air. Warren Bennis, the great management consultant, said that the greatest challenge of the 21st century is the management of distraction. We've all got 25 different priorities, and you're throwing another priority on the heap. So whether someone commits to it or not can be very much dependent on, you know, where they see it in the scheme of what they're doing. So the best way to get someone's commitment actually is to ask for it. A lot of people, again, assume that other people will commit to it just because you've explained it and just because they understand it. But, and maybe you assume that they accept it. But to commit to it, you should ask people. And the way to do this is simply to do this. Ask people, just say to people, can I get your commitment to get this report written by the close of business today? That's not a disrespectful question. Can I get your commitment to speak up at the meeting this afternoon? Ask people for their commitment. Now, when you ask people for their commitment, you'll only get 3 responses. Well, maybe even 4. You might get a nod, you might get a grunt, or you might get a yes, or you might get nothing. Maybe also you might get a no. Whatever you get, it's feedback to you. And if, of course, you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, then that person has made a commitment. And therefore, it's much more difficult for them to shirk that commitment because they've made it to you. Now, if they say no, of course, then you open up another conversation about why and what's in the way, and you know, of course, you talk about that. But isn't it better to know that right there and then than it would be later on when you get upset because they haven't actually committed to achieving an expectation that you have of them? So that's not the end of the road. We've got 2 more questions. The next thing that's important, of course, is, do they know how they're performing against expectations? And this, of course, is about feedback. This is why we give feedback, to let people know whether or not they have met the expectations that you have in mind. So have you given people regular feedback about whether they've met those expectations, whether they've exceeded them, or whether they haven't met them, or whether they've met them? You know, it's important to think about that. Now, the very last question, I think, is very important for some of you, because I know in some of your organisations you have roadblocks. Am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? For example, if somebody in another team is delaying getting information to your team member so that they can complete a report by the close of business today, then obviously that's a roadblock. And what it means is that your team member is not able to finish the work that they need to do. And of course, they can make that an excuse, and it's probably quite a legitimate excuse. So what are you doing to try to support your team to meet those expectations? So what roadblocks are you removing, or what roadblocks perhaps you can't remove, but have you given them 100% support in terms of meeting those expectations? So you can see it's quite a complex thing, isn't it? And, you know, all of those things are critical questions in relation to managing expectations. And if any of them go missing, well, of course, what it means is that you're going to get a suboptimal level of performance that you won't be happy with. All right, so if you've got any questions or comments, please type them in the question box and I'll happily deal with them. While you might be thinking about that, I'd like to move on to a couple of key principles around giving feedback that I think are very, very important. One of those principles is timing. The quicker after an event you give feedback, the better. So whether it's positive or negative, I might say. Why is that the case? Well, obviously, if you give feedback immediately after the event, you are signaling to the other person that it is a key priority, whatever it is that you're going to give feedback about. And so they know that from your priorities that it's important. So that's obviously important. Secondly, it's fresh in your mind, and if you used a critical incident or an example to explain or to contextualize your feedback, it's fresh in the mind of the other person as well as in the mind of yourself. So there's two good reasons for doing that. Now, I find, again, if you left feedback to the performance review, say it was 6 months after the event, then it's going to have very little impact. So if you said to somebody, look, I didn't get a chance to talk to you 6 months ago, but you spoke up, from what I can remember, you spoke up really well at the team meeting. Now, the person probably is thinking to themselves, you know, if you really, might not say this, of course, but they might think, well, if you really believed I did a good job at that meeting, you probably would have said something at the time and not left it for 6 months later. So it loses its impact the later you leave it. Now, we're all busy people, so it sounds simple enough to give feedback straight after the event. But what we've got to do is down tools and give the feedback as soon as possible after the situation or event or whatever. Because if we don't do that, it's going to lose its impact, and then after a while we'll think to ourselves, there's no point now in me giving this feedback, the horse has bolted. And of course you then have a good excuse not to give the feedback. So you can see that timing is critically important. Of course, what is also important is to be very specific about your feedback. So what we're doing is we're trying not to personalize it. What we're actually trying to do is to talk in very specific terms about the feedback. And so we're talking about the behavior. The feedback is about the behavior. It's not about the person. Okay, now this is an important distinction. When people get defensive about feedback, it's often because they perceive it as being about them personally. So for example, if you said to someone, you've got a terrible attitude, well, obviously they're going to accept that as a negative about themselves, even though in your mind you might think it's true. The truth is they're not going to accept it, and you'll probably see how bad their attitude really is once you give that feedback. So you need to be very specific about it. Now, let me take that a step further. Let me give you some examples. Imagine if I gave you this feedback and I said to you this. I said, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now, imagine if I said that to you. Now, what are you thinking? You're probably thinking, I wonder what I did wrong. You know, you'd be thinking to yourself, I must have done something wrong because, you know, he said or she said, overall it could be better. So it's not very specific, that feedback. And probably it's going to be more damaging than helpful by giving that very generalized feedback. What about if you said this? What about if you said something like this? Great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment, maybe for next time, it would be better to invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. You see how much more effective that is? So I've said what I liked about it, and I've also given the other person a small tip on what they might do to improve things next time. That is more likely to be received correctly, and it's more likely to be actually adopted as a result of the feedback. So being specific is very important. Now, the good news for you is that, feedback, you can have at least some time between the time something happens and the time you give someone feedback. So you can think through in your head, how can I say this as specifically as I can? What did I like about that? What didn't I like about that behaviour? And be very specific about what you're seeing. And that works really, really well. Okay. I often use an SBI approach. SBI standing for Situation, Behaviour and Impact. Situation is explaining the event at this morning's meeting. Behaviour is the behaviour itself that I'm going to comment on. And the impact is the impact of it overall. Okay? So how I might improve that last bit of feedback there is I might say, maybe for next time you could invite more comments from the group to get them more involved, and that way it's likely that they're going to be more engaged and persuaded by your ideas. So I've talked about the impact of that. Now the other thing, of course, about feedback, and I've mentioned this several times so far in the broadcast, is it needs to be frequent. It's not a one-off thing. You need to be giving regular feedback, and you need to be giving, and as you could see from the figures before, obviously people want this feedback. So, by not giving it, you're not actually fulfilling the needs that your team have. So, moment by moment, situation by situation, comment by comment, whatever, you need to be giving regular feedback all the time. It's really, really important. So, of course, your homework is going to be about that, and we'll get you started on that pretty much this afternoon after this webinar. Now, the other thing about feedback that's really important is it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. So what I mean by that is that you need to be asking questions of people. So one of the obvious questions you could ask people is, how did you think the presentation went this morning at this morning's meeting? And let them give you the feedback about how they went. And then you could say, would you be open to some more feedback? So I'm being respectful. And they say yes, and then you can then give them the feedback that I just mentioned earlier on. So the questions that you ask people are why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. They're all open-ended questions which basically should give you more than a one-word answer. So in other words, try and engage the other person in a dialogue around their feedback. So in fact, the more you can get others to critique their own performance, the better, because people don't argue with their own data. So if their feedback about themselves is the same feedback that you have for them, then you can just simply say, spot on, that's exactly what I thought too. And of course, if it's different, you can say, well, I've just got a slightly different take on that, or I've got a different way of looking at it. And then you can explain that to people. They're more likely to be receptive and open to that, having been asked for their own particular feedback on their own performance. Now, the other thing I'd strongly recommend, and I wouldn't mind getting your point of view on this, but I believe that all feedback, or most feedback, let's say that, should be done in private. I'm even talking about positive feedback. There are some people in your organisation who actually do not appreciate being the centre of attention. So you have a morning tea and you make a comment about somebody that's very positive and very, it's good feedback. They might be squirming and embarrassed about being made the centre of attention. Be careful with that. I know there's an old adage about praising in public and criticising in private. I'm not absolutely convinced about that. I think to play it safe, all feedback should be done in private. Why? It's still going to be genuine. In fact, more genuine, because it's one-on-one and you're not grandstanding trying to sort of appear as if you're an impressive leader by giving positive feedback in front of everybody else. What do people think about that? I'd be interested to know what your opinion is. Does anyone want to type in? Do you agree with me or disagree? I'm just keen to hear what you think. I'm not saying you shouldn't give feedback in public, but just be aware that not everybody appreciates it done that way. That's my point. Anyway, I'll be interested to see if you've got any comment that you'd like to make about that. All right, now, of course, the whole exercise around feedback is to find an example or what we might call a critical incident that you can build upon. So, if there's some tangible example that you can use to build your feedback around, it then becomes contextualized. So, for example, if somebody handled themselves really well on the telephone with an irate stakeholder or customer, and it was handled really, really well, in other words, you kept your cool under a lot of pressure, your manager then would use that to explain how impressed they were with the way you kept your calm and kept your cool put under that pressure. Okay, and that is a lot more meaningful than to say to someone, you're really calm under pressure. I've used a context, I've used a situation to explain that to people. So use critical incidents, and that's why timing's important. If you give that feedback early on, or straight after the event, then it's fresh in the minds of you and the other person. Now, the only reason that you give feedback, is so that you can either reinforce certain behaviours for the future, in other words, positive feedback, or to change behaviours for the future. There is no other reason for giving feedback other than to either reinforce or change behaviour for the future. So don't get bogged down in all the nitty-gritty detail around he said this and she said that. Sure, sometimes you need to talk to people about the context and why it's the case. But at the end of the day, it is all about the future. And you can even say, look, this is all about just making sure that it doesn't happen again. Or this is all about making sure that you continue that because it was great and it had a great impact. So it is all about the future, and it's important for you to recognise that. That's why you're doing it. And it's sometimes useful to remind the other person that as well. Okay. Now, let me talk about some of the more challenging conversations or feedback that you have. And let me give you a couple of very simple tips that might help you. When you're having you're obviously giving negative feedback on performance. The whole purpose of that is not to get into an argument with the other person about it, or even a disagreement. Now, there's two tactics that you can use there. Now, the other person might want to have an argument with you about it, but there's two things you can do. You can say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. So if you say that, you're basically saying that, no, I'm not going to argue. Or you can say, if it's a small matter, you can say, let's agree to disagree. Let's agree to disagree, and then move on from there. So it's not a confrontation, and it's certainly not an argument, and it never should be. And you need to control that, because obviously if it ends up being a confrontation, an argument, it's not going to be effective regardless of who wins the confrontation or argument. It's not about winning. Another thing that's very important in these difficult performance conversations is to focus on the behaviour. Focus on the performance. Don't generalise about the other person. Talk about the behaviour, and separate the person, if you like, from the behaviour. So that's why critical incidents are really important, because you can then explain that. So for example, let's say that a couple of your team members who are new came up with some really positive contributions in your team meeting. And let's say that one of the old stages in your team decided to interrupt them both. In other words, discourage them from continuing. Your feedback to them after that is to the old stager after the meeting would be something along the lines of, do you remember when you spoke up in the meeting when Jack and John said what they did? And they say yes, and say, my concern with that is not whether you were right or wrong. My concern with that is what sort of impact it might have on those two to contribute again in the future. And they start arguing with you about whether it's right and wrong. You just say, no, I don't want to talk about whether it's right or wrong. That's beside the point. My point is, there's a good chance that they may not next time feel comfortable speaking up, and I don't want that to happen because I'm trying to create a situation here where people can feel open and comfortable to speak up. You see what I mean? That's the behaviour. So get to the nub of what it is that you're really trying to talk about. And as I said earlier, focus on the future. This is all about modifying behaviour for the future. So talk about it in those terms. And of course, the other thing that you can do is you can talk about strengths as well as weaknesses. Now, I know there's this old adage about, the sandwich technique where, you give them something positive at the beginning and then you tell them, you give them the negative feedback and then you finish something positive. I don't buy that. I think that's just nonsense. I think you get straight to what you need to say. However, at the end of the conversation, it's fair and reasonable for you to encourage them by saying to them, I'm sure that this can be modified next time round. I'm sure this can, I'm sure you can change this behaviour next time, whatever it might be. You're giving the person some belief that you think they can change, because otherwise, what's the point of giving them feedback? If you don't really think they're going to change, why in heaven's name are you giving them feedback? You obviously must believe it can be changed. So why not just say it? Because it's a reasonable thing to say. Now, the other thing on more complicated matters is you need to ask a lot of questions, excuse me, and seek out the cause. Try and look for the reason or the cause. Sorry, I'm just off on a tangent and I've just missed a couple of questions, guys. So let me just go back. Daniel's asking, I agree with feedback in private. We work in an open office. So my question would be, how do I go about giving feedback then? Right, okay, that's what I'd suggest there, Daniel, is, look, you're going to have to find either a room, book a room, if it's something where it'll take a bit of time, go outside, just pick your moment. Open office environments are not ideal for feedback. I agree with you. And I think you've just got to work out a way of doing that, because obviously, it's inconvenient. Open office environments, ironically, actually stop and stifle communication. Because if you have a conversation with someone, you know that there are another 6 people that will overhear it, and quite happy to overhear it. So you'll just have to find a space somewhere where you can do that in private. Unfortunately, there's no other answer to that. Oh, sorry, that was Elizabeth. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. Keeping in mind that not everyone appreciates being approached in such an open arena. Yeah, so sorry, Elizabeth, that's you. I got it mixed up with Daniel. Look, yeah, so same thing. I mean, it's exactly what I said. You just need to find the opportunity. You need to find the space. And so you just need to think about how you're going to do that. All right, there is no other way around it, unfortunately, but there's no point in doing it in front of everybody else. It's not going to work, as you allude to. Okay, moving right along. Thank you for those questions. Really good. Thank you. A couple of other things to keep in mind when you're when you're having conversations on poor performance. A couple of things to think about. When you have to have a conversation with someone about poor performance, get straight to the point. Small talk and chit-chat has no place here. If you pull someone away from the workplace to have a conversation with them about feedback, negative feedback, If you get into some sort of chit chat about something to put them at ease, all you'll do is make them more stressed, because all they're going to be thinking about is, what's all this about? When are you going to tell me? So just get straight to the point. Now, you don't have to do it in an aggressive way. It just means get straight to the point. The reason I wanted to talk to you was blah, 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 right? Just get straight to the point. And of course, get straight to explaining the purpose of the meeting. So talk about the critical incident and explain the behaviour that you want to refer to. Get straight to the point. Now, what you do here is then you ask a question. So the question might be, what's your perspective on that? Or what do you think about that? Now, by doing that, you're encouraging the other person to talk. In other words, we're creating a dialogue, not a monologue. So get the other one to talk. Now, the best way to get someone to talk, ask them a question, sit back in your chair and say nothing. You will find that the tension will rise because nothing's being said, and they will break that silence 9 times out of 10. Unless, of course, you do, which is, of course, not appropriate. So you just got to hold the line and be patient and get the person to talk. Now, while they're talking, it is really important for you to bite your tongue until it bleeds. You must not, under any circumstances, interrupt them, no matter what they say. So they might make accusations, they might have facts that are not facts, they might have a completely wrong perspective. Hear them out. Why? Very simple. At the end of it, once they're finished, you can say, look, there's just a couple of things that I'd like to talk about that you just mentioned. You see? You talk about them after they've finished. Why? Because very soon you're going to speak. And the last thing that you want is for them to interrupt you. And so if they do that, you're in a position where you can say, well, just a moment, I gave you a fair go, and I'd appreciate the same opportunity. And you can do that. You have the moral high ground if you bite your tongue until it bleeds. Okay? So that's very important. And it's so tempting to jump in and correct people. You can correct people, but do it after they've finished, because it's important to encourage them to be engaged in the conversation about poor performance, because it's not a conversation otherwise, is it? So there's some things that might assist you. So folks, have you got any other questions or any observations you would like to throw at me at this point? No, not really, or people might be frantically typing. Anyway, if you have, go for it, because I'm just going to give you your first bit of homework. I simply want you to do this. It's not going to be hard. Well, it might be hard if you're not used to it, I guess. But I want you to commit to giving positive feedback 3 times a day for a week. Now, if that's a 5-day week, that's 15 pieces of positive feedback for a week. And find out what happens. Now, when I say positive feedback, I'm talking, it's got to be genuine. And some people at this point say to me, well, I can't, how do I find these 3 things? Well, just look, they're there. There are 3 good things going on in your workplace every single day. The question is, are you acknowledging that at the time? Now, you commit to 3, so write yourself a little post-it note, put it on your computer. I don't care how you remind yourself, put it on your notice board. Whatever you need to do to remind yourself every single day 3 bits of positive feedback. It's really, really important to do that. And it's good to hear. Daniel says it's going on the whiteboard now. Well done, Daniel. That's great. So just do it, and you will find unbelievable results. You'll get some funny looks to start with, which probably suggests you haven't been doing it. But after a while, you'll find that morale will improve, energy levels will rise, you'll feel better about yourself, you'll get stuff done. But you've got to do it. Don't wait for your boss to do it, you do it. You're in charge of your own area of responsibility. So folks, that's it from me. So next time we meet, just this last slide here, you don't forget you'll get an email from me with the slides today. You'll get a copy of the recording. It'll be a link, and you'll also get an invitation to complete the influencing capabilities profile, which is part of the cost of all of this. So it's not like you've got to pay extra or anything. It's voluntary. You don't have to do it. I just think you'll probably get more out of Unit 2 if you do it. There's a two-step process there, so it's a security thing. You type your email address in and I give you approval. Once I give you approval, then you can get on with it. It's just a security thing, although it takes a little longer. All right, so that's it from me. Thanks everyone, and we'll catch up, I think, very shortly because we had that mishap last week. So all the best, and good luck with giving the positive feedback, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you and goodbye.